Welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
Dear friends and lovers of literature, here we are again with JLF at the British Library 2021.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
Do you feel that Britain and India can best intersect culturally?
Well, we've been intersecting for a long time. It's not that we will have to intersect. If you look at our cultural and historical relations, we go back a long way.
That may be nations or cultures or religions or sexualities, class, culture, gender, race, all those things, but that distance is somehow reduced or bridged, because we're connecting at a very basic human level.
I believe in the ability to convey meaning by the written word is our superpower.
Welcome back to the 8th edition of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival. We're delighted to present Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. Sathnam Sanghera, William Dalrymple and Swapan Dasgupta in conversation with Mukulika Banerjee. A session which explores the reality and legacy of the British Empire with Sathnam Sanghera's latest book, Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. Sanghera's acclaimed narrative focuses on the importance of accepting Britain's imperial past in order to understand its present and future. William Dalrymple's recent release is the Company Quartet, a 4-book collection chronicling the extraordinary story of the rise and fall of the East India Company, which spans over 200 years of tumultuous colonial history and bloody resistance. Author and politician Swapan Dasgupta's latest book is Awakening Bharat Mata, the political beliefs of the Indian right, and coming together they speak to academic and author Mukulika Banerjee to understand why the existence of the British Empire is often forgotten in Britain and the importance of coming to terms with a troubled past. Sathnam Sanghera is a journalist and an author who has been shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards twice for his memoir The Boy with the Top Knot and his novel Marriage Material, and has also been shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize, the Penn Accolade Prize and Mind Book of the Year. His third book, Empireland, How Imperialism Shaped Modern Britain, became an instant Sunday Times bestseller on release in 2021. William Dalrymple is the best-selling author of In Xanadu, City of Jinns, From the Holy Mountain and Age of Kali, to name a few. He has won many awards, including the Wolfson Prize for History, the Hemingway, the Thomas Cook, and the Duff Cooper Memorial Prize. He's one of the co-founders and co-directors of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Swapan Dasgupta is a member of parliament and columnist for major Indian newspapers. A journalist for 30 years, he occupied senior editorial positions at the Times of India, Indian Express and India Today. He's the author of Awakening Bharat Mata, the political beliefs of the Indian right. In 2015, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan and was nominated to the Rajya Sabha. Mukulika Banerjee was inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Centre from 2015 to 2020 and is associate professor in social anthropology at the London School of Economics. Her books include Why India Votes, The Pathan Unarmed, and The Sari and Edited Muslim Portraits. She has just completed a monograph, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India. You can access all our sessions at london.jlflitfest.org. All our sessions are also available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, and our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. Help JLF London bring more quality content to you in these uncertain and strengthen the community by donating to the link provided. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. Sathnam Sanghera, William Dalrymple, and Swapan Dasgupta in conversation with Mukulika Banerjee. Over to you, Mukulika.
Thank you very much, Kritika, and welcome everyone to this very exciting session with three excellent speakers, each with very specific points of view that we hope to bring out in a discussion between all of us. Now, last year, the finale of JLF London was a debate about the place of statues in Britain's public life. You can watch it online, it is available, and it was a remarkable debate because we had strong opinions on both sides of the motion of why statues should be brought down, and on the other side, why bringing down statues was not the solution. It came on the back of the Black Lives Matter movement and the toppling of slave owner stroke philanthropist Colston's statue in the British city of Bristol, and it was an important and urgent issue to debate last year. In the UK, it had led to a national conversation about all other statues that occupy prime locations in town squares and cities. There were calls also for the removal of the statue of Robert Clive outside the UK government's Foreign Office, a topic on which William Dalrymple wrote a memorable piece. Now, since we had that debate last year, there have been two important contributions to this conversation. The publication of William Dalrymple's handsome Company Quartet set detailing the rise and fall of the East India Company, and Sathnam Sanghera's Empireland. The blurb on the back cover of Empireland states, quote, "Let's face it, imperialism is not something that can be erased with a few statues being torn down or a few institutions facing up to their dark pasts. It exists as a legacy and explains who we are as a nation," unquote. So today we've invited Sathnam and William to speak on this panel, and here they'll be joined by the inimitable Swapan Dasgupta, historian and Anglophile, to talk about some of these issues that have been brought into sharper relief in the last 12 months. So let me start by asking Sathnam, since your book is new and has contributed in taking this conversation forward, your book makes the very important point that contemporary racism and anti-immigrant prejudice can only be tackled by the teaching of history of the empire. Why do you say that?
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I mean, statues are all very interesting, but I think ultimately they're just street furniture. They've been around for centuries. We haven't noticed them. I think it's much more important to talk about more profound legacies of empire in Britain, not least multiculturalism. The reason I'm here, the reason my parents came here is because the British went to India a couple of centuries ago. So that's a very profound legacy that's changed the nature of Britain. I would argue that we have a certain flavor of racism in this country, which goes back to empire. You can trace the way post-war immigrants like my parents were treated in Britain straight back to India. The way they were treated was pretty much how the British treated Indians in the 1920s and 1930s. But there's many other legacies. There's the money we made in empire, our economy. There's so many businesses that originally were established in the age of empire, from Shell to Liberties to Lloyd's of London, which was founded, at a time of slavery. There's our language, the English language, which has so many words of Indian origin, Native American origin, Australian origin. The language reflects empire. There's our food, curry being the most popular dish in Britain. There's our drinks, all the alcohol that was developed to help imperialists conquer half a quarter of the planet. Gin and tonics, pale ale. I already worked out actually recently when I was writing the book that it was General Dyer's dad that opened the first brewery in India. I didn't know that. And the way we travel also, the British, wherever you go in the world, you'll meet A, a Sikh taxi driver, and B, a British person. We travel like no other nation on earth. And I think that goes directly back to empire. Also, the way we travel goes back to empire. We tend to not speak the language. We kind of bark English at people. We tend not to integrate, even though we want that from the immigrants who come here. We stick to ourselves, to the other British people. And we generally don't partake of the food either. So I think there are thousands of modern legacies from empire. And part of the reason we're so screwed up in our politics is because we never face up to the fact that we ran a quarter of the planet. One of the profound reasons why we could never stand being in the European Union is that we were the world superpower for such a long time. And we didn't like the idea of taking rules from the European Union. And Brexiteer politicians used the language of colonialism when we broke free. I mean, we had Boris Johnson talking about global Britain. We had Nigel Farage during his Brexit speech, his independence speech, talking about how we'd got independence without a single shot being fired, which is the language of colonialism. So I think you can trace empire into so many aspects of modern British life. And we need to think about it rather than just being nostalgic about it in a vague kind of rose-tinted way.
Thank you so much, Sathnam. You've covered a lot of ground there, and I can see that each of the things that you've mentioned as an example, of course, is a chapter in your book. So there is a lot of evidence that you provide for each of the claims that you're making. William, can I ask you, on the basis of your book sales and the number of people who read and engage with your work, is your impression that there is a real appetite to understand what happened in the 200 years of British colonialism of India?
I think there is now, and not just my book sales, but Sathnam's amazing book sales, which I think have far outstripped mine, evidence of how many people realize that they have not received an education. Many of the people listening to this talk will not be from Britain, and they'll be surprised to learn that the empire basically doesn't feature on our history syllabuses. It jumps from, in many cases, there are exceptions to this, and some there is provision in the curriculum for individual teachers who are interested in this to pursue topics within the empire, but it's not a compulsory thing at all to learn anything between the Tudors and Florence Nightingale. And you have a brief mention of the emancipation of the slaves, but the general impression is given that the same nation which emancipated the slaves went on to liberate Europe from the Nazis, and that the British have somehow always been on the side of anti-racism, that they are this angelic force in history who have wielded liberty, and then that chimes with a lot of sort of Tory party stuff about British values, which are understood to be ones of liberty and freedom. And the fact that we enslaved 2/3 of the planet very recently, within the lifetimes of many of our parents, is totally forgotten. And not only is it forgotten, that the whole visual apparatus of it has been dismantled. The pictures, most famous pictures in 19th century Britain, like Dr. Brydon arriving on his practicing nag from in Jalalabad at the end of the First Afghan War, or the last soldiers of the 51st at the Battle of Gundamuk. All these people, all these pictures were taken down, and Dr. Brydon now sits in a regimental museum in Somerset, very far from the prime walls of the Tate, where he sat, or where he rode as recently as the 1950s. And in institutions and in families, it's as if the whole apparatus of empire just got put in an attic, locked up in a trunk and forgotten about. And suddenly people are remembering it. And my Company Quartet is now, a work of 20 years. And when I started 20 years ago, there was no interest in this. There'd been a little flutter of it when the Jewel and the Crown came out at the end of the 80s, or the mid 80s. And when that Gandhi film with Richard Attenborough was won all the Oscars a year or two before, but then it sort of disappeared into the background, and it's definitely changing. And both the fact of Sathnam's book and the extraordinary way it's been received and you should ask him about this. Both the incredibly warm reception critically and the high sales on one hand, but also the foul postbag he's received from a lot of white Britons who basically accused him of being a traitor, is evidence of what a sort of new topic this is. That a lot of people are simply not aware of it. That they think Sathnam must have made it up. That all this stuff is being reconsidered for the first time, and I think it's a very important thing. A country needs to understand where it's come from if it's to understand where it is, just like an individual does. And so I hugely applaud the book. I greatly enjoyed it. It's both very witty and amusing, and also very important and exemplary work of history. And it's long listing for the biggest non-fiction prize this week is I think a very exciting and welcomed accolade for it.
Thank you, William. So let me bring Swapan Dasgupta in here. You've known Britain for very many decades. You came here as a student. Did you find it odd when you first came to Britain and made friends that people did not seem to know British history in the way that you did?
Well, not really. I mean, I went to an institution where people actually studied the most obscure of subjects, and it was a reflection of British eccentricity that you had people studying Sanskrit, British students, white British students. You had people studying Mongolian and other things like that. So maybe my experience was a bit odd and not typical in that sense. But yes, I think all over the world, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in India, I think history is at a discount. Only last week, I was giving a talk to the Academy for the Bureaucrats, which is in Missouri. And I was talking about the India's neighborhood. And when I went into some rather obscure details about Afghan policy, of which was followed from the 1830s onwards, I found, absolute bewilderment that most people hadn't been exposed to it. So never mind Dr. Bryden, who had been shoved into a small attic or maybe a small room in Somerset. I think even in India, we don't sometimes realize that how much the defense of India and the Afghan policy played a role in shaping our history. When I first encountered Empireland by Sathnam in one of the reviews in the British papers, I was initially struck with a degree of apprehension. I said, oh my God, another of the post-colonial angst books. And I often think that maybe it's sort of politically correct for Asian British to write about everything decrying the empire. Now, of course, there are many facets of the empire which are worth rubbishing and which really doesn't call for any form of glorification. But at the end of the day, empire was a reality. It was a huge reality, not only to the people who were colonized, but also in the metropolitan centers. And it obviously played a very, very important role in shaping that, their mental makeup, their institutions, their economy, their politics in every way. Now, there is one thing to say, which is a one of denial, to say, oh, forget it. We'll just wipe the slate clean and not regard that. But that's not going to happen. We are faced with the reality of empire. And the point about the empire is that it always has 2 or 3 different views to take it. Now, in one sense, I can say Willie's books are, at one level, could be treated as the heroic tales of, swashbuckling adventurers who went into India and, did some good things, a lot of nasty things, and had very colorful lives. I mean, that's G.A. Henty and William Dalrymple can be equated in one way. But there is another way. In India, for instance, we have the most unusual debate over what is the remodeling of the central vista, where for the first time, I was very struck that how many people ended up as being arch defenders of Edwin Lutyens. And it struck me that he said, you're not being faithful to the Lutyens view of Delhi, etc. Now, I'm a great admirer of Lutyens. I believe he did things, but I believe he left an incomplete project there, and that's some of those improvements are. But there is the thing where you blame everything for what they call the colonial mindset. You know, every mishap in the bureaucracy, every inefficiency is blamed on the colonial mindset. At the same time, you have a tacit glorification of the empire. At one extreme, you might find Niraj Chaudhary's dedication to the British Empire in India, which conferred subjecthood on us, but withheld citizenship, but to which we owe everything that's true and living within us. You know, that's one extreme. The other extreme is Shashi Tharoor of late, who was a bit of an Anglophile like me, who suddenly took up the cudgels of Arpam Dutt. So there are both these things which are there. And what's great about Sathnam's book is that he's brought in various of the literature, I feel, and how it's impacted on contemporary Britain. It's a British debate primarily. It's not an Indian debate. That I think is a very important point to make. And it's an important contribution as far as the Britain, that you take a little more nuanced view of the empire, that you understand what it was all about. Don't just go around beheading statues. Don't just go around renaming places, but understand what it was all about. And what you are to today is partly because of the empire. By the way, I must tell you that the best Indian food is still, I believe, available in Britain. And I love Sherwood's mango chutney more than any other chutney I get in India.
Let me bring you a bottle next week. I think it's very interesting. There's a great deal of agreement in this panel. When I put this panel together, I was expecting everyone to be slightly at loggerheads with each other. And I think all three of us can agree here that what's most important is that people read and understand and try and analyze history. That it shouldn't be forgotten, but it should be read.
Sorry, as all of you as historians who write history would say that, right? There's a commitment to research and writing and communicating that history which you share, but there are two distinct stories, as Swapan's saying. There is a story in India and there's a story in Britain, and I think Sathnam's book highlights the dangers of forgetting that history and the direct consequences it has in contemporary politics, in the culture wars that we see. But also, people don't read or not read history because they don't like to or they don't want to. We are talking about the curriculum of history in schools. I mean, these are political questions, aren't they, of how a nation's past is remembered and taught and debated critically, by all means, from both sides. But the fact that it's completely absent from the curriculum is what is surprising and deeply worrying. Sathnam?
Yeah, and I guess, it's not just that it's absent. I mean, actually, empire is taught a bit now. I mean, in Key Stage 3, empire's there, but the only compulsory history on the national curriculum is the Holocaust, quite rightly. But I would say British Empire needs to be compulsory, given it's the biggest thing we ever did. And part of the reason it's never been taught properly is that there's never been agreement. In recent times, we've had Michael Gove suggesting that we should teach the glories of empire. And then we have, Jeremy Corbyn saying we should teach the crimes of empire. And I think both are not the good way forward. We need to seek to understand empire rather than just talk about our pride and our shame. We're talking about 500 years of really complicated history. A lot of very bad things happened. A lot of, good things happened. And to try to summarize the whole experience as good or bad, to give it like a 5-star rating of a kettle you bought on Amazon, it just doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, in recent times, all the best-selling books have been about whether empire was good or bad. I'm thinking of Niall Ferguson, mainly, about a decade ago. And I think looking at this complicated experience through that prism has made us very dysfunctional, and it makes it impossible to teach. And the other thing is, it's not that it's not just taught. Also, the things we do teach, like, say, for example, the Tudors and World War I, World War II, we don't mention the imperial aspects to it. So there were black people around Tudor time. Queen Elizabeth I was complaining about there being too many black people in London in the 1600s. And in both world wars, you know, I think 6 million colonial subjects in total fought for a nation that had colonized them. I wasn't taught that, even though I sat through about 16 Remembrance Day services and was taught World War I and World War II over 3 years. At no point did anyone say, by the way, you lot, your diverse student body, your ancestors were also there. So there's levels of amnesia when it comes to empire.
Yeah. So, William, do you see a divergence of views a little bit here, or the importance of remembering Britain's own past as not entirely white? So there are two aspects to the story, right? What Britain was doing abroad, but also what was happening in Britain at the time, all, you know, for the past 500 years. So what Sathnam has just mentioned about the issue of race and racism is an old problem. And it's an old problem, but its 20th century and its 21st century incarnation is a very specific kind, which is about forgetting.
Well, it's, as Sathnam rightly said, it's a very complicated issue. And while it's certainly true, for example, that Queen Elizabeth complained about the number of black people in Elizabethan London, which is a lovely fact. I had no idea that, not a lovely fact, but a surprising fact. I had no idea that was true until I read it in Sathnam's writing. The other thing, though, that was equally true of Queen Elizabeth's reign was that she was busy making an alliance with the Moroccans against the Catholic Spanish. And there were various joint projects that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the Muslim Moroccans allied with the Elizabethan court with a view to attacking piratically Spanish and Portuguese treasure ships coming back from the New World. And there was even a suggestion of a joint colonization project, which the Sultan of Morocco suggested that the Moroccans might be better to settle in Virginia than the white British, as they were better dealing with the heat and the climatic extremes. And there exists still in the Moroccan embassy in London, I've seen it, the extraordinary full-length portrait of Morocco's ambassador to Elizabethan England, who was this extraordinary handsome guy, but very much the sort of depicted by the Tudor portrait painter as this sort of almost Shakespearean villain with a kind of wicked, handsome gleam in his eye. And that sort of level of complexity where, yes, you have racism against one people, but you also have the possibility of an alliance with the Muslims in Morocco, is the kind of complexity that we need to understand when we read and write history.
Thank you.
May I just chip in? Yeah, may I just chip in on something? I think Sathnam was quite right in decrying what one Australian Prime Minister, Bob Menzies, very many years ago called the black armband view of history. And I think that there's a danger of that, and well, there is a danger equally of a mindless glorification, a rah-rah thing of, taking over. But at the same time, I think what's the most important thing about the empire was that it's interesting. I don't think anyone can deny that fact, that it was a highly interesting part of people's existence, sometimes rather brutal. Secondly, I would somehow have some reservations and misgivings over viewing the entire empire project and the empire experience through the prism of the debates within British multiculturalism. I think it's a far bigger enterprise. Oh, no doubt that's a part of it. But I think one of the dangers which we are seeing increasingly these days is that the writings on empire in the so-called mother country has been more or less becoming shaped by these debates. And I think the Brexit debate on it has played a very major role on that. Now, I was struck by the fact that in India, for instance, when we looked at the Afghan, when at least I don't think we should say we, I mean, I'm a bit of an oddity in this respect. I told when someone said, what should we read about Afghanistan? I said, well, you could start by reading Kim, and then you could follow it up by reading some of Kipling's poems on Afghanistan. And I can see Willie smirking because he knows exactly what I'm talking about. And, the point is that when you're talking about the defense of India,
you're wounded on Afghanistan's plane, roll on your rifle and all that stuff.
1,000 pounds of education falls to a Peter Sill.
We are going to run out of time soon. I'm going to give.
I just made a very, very small point. Now, various institutions of empire have been altered unrecognizably. And I'll give the most popular one, cricket. It was a game of empire, maybe not in the entire empire, but at least in the so-called English-speaking, Anglophone parts of the empire. The manner in which the culture of cricket, from Douglas Jardine to Virat Kohli, has changed is amazing. Is it any longer an English game, I wonder?
Well,
and do enough people in England play it? That's the question. It's not. So it's been taken over into the fields of India and in the fields of Pakistan, where it's far more popular that way. Now, therefore, please, when you're talking about empire, please have it in mind that the selective amnesia of metropolitan Britain should not be the determining factor in how it is shaped. And there were many other experiences which don't come in. And what struck me about Sathnam's book is that while he's certainly gone into the entire literature, there's an entirely different set of literature which exists. Whether in Africa, whether in India, whether in some other parts of the world, about how the colonial experience was seen. And I think that the totality of that is sometimes not taken into account.
Thank you, Swapan. In fact, I would say the big move, of course, the other big thing that has happened since we were debating these issues last year is the growing momentum of decolonizing the curriculum movement, which has been precisely about recognizing, excavating, reading, debating and discussing those points of view or those pieces of knowledge produced in Asia, in Africa. And
equally, the culture wars waged by the Tory culture minister, particularly, and the attacks on the National Trust for pointing out the colonial origins of many of the great houses and so on. That has definitely hotted up in the last year, and the sense of resistance from the British right that various organisations like Stava statues and so on, or and various other organisations to monitor what they see as the woke relabeling of National Trust houses. Sathnam has been strongly involved in a lot of this stuff.
In fact, sadly, I think this is such a contested issue. We can't. We'll have to end on that note, Sathnam. We want to hear from you what, in fact, has been the backlash to this, because Swapan can say the empire is interesting. I think if you're on the receiving end of the violence of empire, it probably doesn't. Interesting is not the word you might use for the empire. And the backlash that has an informed history of empire has been very unwelcome. So it is not an uncontested activity to revisit and have a nuanced account of empire. So, Sathnam, you've been in the firing line of this, literally.
Yes.
So you have a couple of minutes to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Black Lives Matter created incredible interest in colonialism, which is why I guess William's book and my book suddenly, they're in the bestseller charts. People want to know about colonialism, how it might have shaped modern racism. But there has been extraordinary backlash, mainly among the right wing of the Conservative Party. I've had many Conservative politicians review my book well, but there's definitely a deliberate culture war happening. And the idea behind it, I've written about it in the updated paperback for Empireland. The idea is amongst a group of Tories that actually to appeal to people in Britain, in the middle of Britain, who are economically left-wing, but socially right-wing. People who are proud of the Queen, proud of the flag, and hate woke people and colonialism being talked about all the time. It's a good way of appealing to them. So we had extraordinary things like the National Trust being criticized for investigating its colonial heritage. We had Oliver Dowd, and the Culture Secretary, who's been fired, I think, last week, who said he would chain himself to a statue of Nelson in Trafalgar Square to stop people tearing it down, even though there was no one wanting to tear down that statue. No one. And similarly, we've got Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, saying he was going to protect Winston Churchill's statue with his last breath. So you have this culture war, which I think is based entirely in fake history, because the stuff they're accusing woke people of is not going to happen. No one's going to tear down the Winston Churchill statue. The National Trust can investigate its colonialism and continue serving, English cream teas to the public. Both things can happen at the same time. And I think ultimately it's going to fail because young people really care about this stuff. And I think they're driving this interest in empire and colonialism. And I feel like it's the last gasp amongst the 50, 60 something white man to kind of hark back to this time where we only had one view of empire.
Thank you very much, all of you, for a fantastic discussion. This is certainly not the last time we'll be talking about these issues.
See you in a year, Mukulika.
Next time. Thank you. Sorry?
See you in a year. This time next year, we'll certainly be back on the program then, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, William, Sathnam, and Mr. Dasgupta for that very interesting conversation on the empire. And thank you, Mukulika, for steering it so beautifully. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience.
Welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
Dear friends and lovers of literature, here we are again with JLF at the British Library 2021.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
Do you feel that Britain and India can best intersect culturally?
Well, we've been intersecting for a long time. It's not that we will have to intersect. If you look at our cultural and historical relations, we go back a long way.
That may be nations or cultures or religions or sexualities, class, culture, gender, race, all those things. But that distance is somehow reduced or bridged because we're connecting at a very basic human level.
I believe in the ability to convey meaning by the written word is our superpower.